It's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Ross Douthat. Ross is a columnist for the New York Times and an author of 3 books. I'm not only an avid reader of his work, but I've also known Ross for 20 years, almost 20 years, as Jim was saying. See, we were college roommates. We both lived in Washington, D.C. after college, and we traveled together on many occasions throughout that time. And I can say that what draws me to his books or his columns or his Twitter feed is, in many ways, what attracted me to become his friend all those years ago. When he talks, it's not only what Ross says that captures your attention, but it's also how he says it. Always with wit and thoughtfulness and a unique and compelling point of view. And our early friendship developed over countless mealtime and late-night discussions amongst friends, where Ross's presence always contributed to a rich and more lively conversation. When Ross writes, he often talks about serious matters of religion and faith. And he does this because he truly loves God and cares for the church. I know this because, as a friend, when we'd travel together in the years after college, I remember how on Sundays, Ross would always step away from our group to attend Sunday Mass. At some point along the way, I decided to start joining him. And I remember the way he'd convincingly explain the teachings of the church to me, a person who was just starting to question my secular pieties. And finally, on Twitter, Ross has recently mentioned the, quote, brutal blood gladiatorial shows, end quote, that he's been participating in with his Catholic sparring partners like Father James Martin in December. And as a friend, I know exactly what he's talking about because Ross once backed me up in a bar brawl in the Purple Shamrock in Boston, Massachusetts. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce my dear friend and my godfather, Mr. Ross Douthat.
I feel like I was lucky to get through that introduction only moderately scathed. But that was incredibly kind and moving and somewhat humbling. So thank you, Brian. And I should add that bar brawl at the Purple Shamrock involved a conflict over the affections of a young lady who eventually became my wife and the mother of my children. So if I am somewhat in some limited way responsible for Brian joining the church, he has also been responsible for a small part of my great happiness as well. So thank you, Brian, for those words. And thank you, Jim and Tom and Lumen Christi and all of you, my fellow pseudo-intellectuals. It's wonderful to be among you today. Occasionally journalists will get introduced as public intellectuals or even, God forbid, thought leaders. And it's always a slightly cringe-inducing experience. And I always try and backpedal and explain, no, I write a weekly or bi-weekly column for a product that in the old days before that was just read on the internet, people would use to line bird cages a few days after you wrote your column, so it's always important to keep that humbling perspective in mind and recognize that as a columnist, you're always an amateur, and so it's good to be among fellow amateurs today for a conversation about the state of religion in America, which is a wonderfully open-ended topic, which will enable me to talk mostly about Wiccan rituals in northern Idaho for 45 minutes, and then the remaining time I'll try and sneak in something about Christianity. No, I'm kidding, but I'll try and, I'm basically going to try and offer a kind of tripartite sketch of where the real divisions in American religious life and in sort of America's different metaphysical world pictures are. And then I'm going to try to offer some, again, slightly amateurish speculations about the ways in which the current order could change or shift or transform over the course of the next 25, 50, or 100 years. But before I do that, I thought to sort of personalize things a little bit, I'd tell you all a little bit about my own religious background, because I think it's sometimes helpful in these kind of conversations to get a sense of where the person doing the analysis is coming from. And it also, I think, feeds into the perspective that I have on the shape of religion in America today. So I grew up in southern Connecticut, in New Haven, and my parents were Episcopalians when I was a kid, and mildly religious, not particularly zealous, a very sort of southern Connecticut style of religiosity. But my mother had certain strange health problems. She had allergies and chemical sensitivities and a lot of the kind of issues that now there are entire aisles of Whole Foods dedicated to dealing with. But back in the early 1980s when I was a kid, if you wanted to find vegetarian products or, laundry soap without perfumes or dyes or something, you had to go to some very strange health food store run by an aging hippie who would shuffle out of the back in a Grateful Dead t-shirt, and, you'd ask for tofu and he'd go, there'd be this tub of tofu with these huge blocks, and it was like the way they used to haul icebergs out of the ponds in Vermont to ship them around the world. He'd have his tongs and bring up the block of tofu, and I still can't eat tofu because of that experience. But so we did a lot of strange sort of un-Southern Connecticut things when I was a kid. We explored weird diets and different sorts of alternative medicine and so on. But my mother also had a friend who recommended that she come with her to a healing service, a kind of charismatic healing service that was held in a high school auditorium in one of the towns around New Haven. And my mother, who was, Ivy League educated and sort of considered herself very intellectually serious and so on, was sort of reluctant to go along with this and went to it and was sort of confirmed in her reluctance by sitting through this, performance where this, woman in loud clothes sang and a band played and there was lots of praise music. And then the woman went around the auditorium and started picking out people as, as sort of the cliched faith healer does, and says, someone in this row has a problem with their knees, someone in this row has a problem with their back, come out into the aisle, I'll pray for you. And at a certain point, she identified my mother, and my mother very reluctantly went out into the aisle and was prayed over, and to her immense shock, fell down on the floor and lay there having some kind of mystical experience for about the next hour or so. And so this was sort of a pivot point in my childhood. I was about 6 years old or 7 at that point, and from then on we sort of entered into the strange world of charismatic Christianity for a period of time, while also sort of continuing to shop around for different Episcopal churches. So we had one foot in the Protestant main line, and then we would go, went to these healing services for several years, and then we sort of went out into the wider world of Pentecostalism and went to strange renewals and revivals all the way to Toronto at one point to hear people roar like lions and bark like dogs. So I had this sort of bifurcated childhood, you might say, where during the week I went to nice, liberal, secular private schools in the greater New Haven area, and on the weekend I went and watched my parents speak in tongues. And then at a certain point, and this is more my mother's story than my own, and hopefully she writes as well, and so hopefully one day she'll tell it herself in full, but we ended up converting as a family, but with my mother as the prime mover, to Roman Catholicism. So we, in effect, did a kind of tour of much of American Christianity with, through the sort of world of health food and natural medicine, a lot of New Age stuff thrown in as well. So while we were never, unlike Marco Rubio, who did a similar tour as a kid, we were never Mormons. There were a few things we never were, but if you listed different strands of American Christianity plus some New Age stuff, we covered a lot of the waterfront. And so this was a distinctive childhood experience, although in many ways also a very American one, because we are a nation of church shoppers in many ways and have been for a long time. But so I carried this background with me when I went into political journalism, which is, for my sins, my vocation, apparently. And one of the striking things about political journalism is that, of course, religion and politics are terribly important to understanding elections and the parties and the coalitions in the United States. So there is an awful lot of coverage of religion from the political press, from people in Washington and New York. But it tends to be understood through a kind of binary, basically. You have the religious right and the secular left. Or maybe you have the religious right and a smaller religious left over there. Or if you're talking about the divisions within Protestantism or Catholicism, you talk about the Catholic left and the Catholic right and so on. And That kind of analysis is useful. I certainly fall into it myself, especially in some of those debates within our own church that Brian referenced. But it's also, I think, insufficient to understanding the kind of strange complexity of American religion as it's actually lived by normal people who don't think about politics or sort of high-flown theological problems all the time. And so, by sort of identifying that complexity, I inevitably imply that even my own analysis is going to be limited, and it will be. But I think, at the very least, it's more useful, instead of just thinking about American religion as divided into, conservative Christianity or traditional religion over here and secularism over here, sort of the liberalism of the New York Times and the Supreme Court and so on. It's better to think of it in terms of three broad categories, three kind of metaphysical world pictures that define American religious life. And the first one is secular. It is the world picture of, elite universities for the most part. It's probably the world picture of most of my talented and impressive colleagues at the New York Times. It's the world picture of the best educated parts of the professional class, scientists, academics, and so forth. And it's a world picture that essentially combines a deep skepticism about the supernatural and the metaphysical with a continued strong commitment to the moral principles that we think of as connected to liberalism, the liberalism that Patrick Deneen talks about in his book, that you can all come and hear him talk about shortly, but is ultimately connected to Christianity and to Western civilization's Christian and monotheistic roots. So there's a combination in the secular world picture of a kind of, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, even though we don't really believe in a creator anymore. That's sort of the heart of the secular picture. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you have, sometimes I call it the traditional picture, and sometimes I call it the biblical picture. And neither of those are quite perfect because I'm using it to encompass some groups that are much newer and don't really deserve to be called traditional exactly, like, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is only 160 years old, and it's not traditionalist in the sense that traditionalist Catholics are traditionalist. And then calling it a biblical world picture doesn't quite work either, because then you exclude Muslims, people who have a sacred text that isn't the Bible. So neither term is precisely right, but they're both useful. Because they both get at the fact that these are people who see themselves as being obedient to a binding religious authority, a particular tradition, a particular revelation, a particular church in the case of Roman Catholics, a particular scripture in the case of sola scriptura Protestants, and in general, for the most part, we're talking about people for whom that tradition is Christianity and the biblical text is the Bible itself. And so the idea is that the essence is there is a revelation, there is an authority, there is something that you have been handed down and that you're trying to conform yourself to. But then you have the world in the middle, which doesn't fall into either of those binary and seemingly opposed categories. And this is the world that I call, I think pretty accurately, the world of spirituality, basically. The world that is the actual sort of religious center of our divided country and culture. And this is a very diverse world, a diverse group. It encompasses everything from, the Esalen Institute on the Pacific coast with its consciousness-raising sessions and so on, to certain kinds of prosperity gospel preaching in Red America, to the people who read Eat, Pray, Love in Blue America. It encompasses certain forms of heretical Christianity, certain forms of New Age spirituality, people who aren't Jewish but are really into Kabbalah. It encompasses a wide range. And depending on where you are, it can blur into the secular world picture or the traditional world picture. So prosperity theology will identify itself as Christian and will sort of overlap and blur into more traditional forms of Christianity, even though its essential message is much more individualistic. It's much, it's the idea that God wants you to be rich and successful, and that theological issues are much less important than just praying your way to the big house, the promotion, and so on. But it blurs into it. And then on the other hand, the closer you get to sort of the secular core, the more this kind of spirituality tries to justify itself in scientific terms. It will say, I'm going to take the parts of Buddhism that I think the study of consciousness has validated. I'm going to take these forms of meditation, Eastern or Western, that fit with my scientific picture of how the brain works, right? So this is someone like Sam Harris, who some of you may have heard of, he was a noted new atheist. He was one of these guys about 10 years ago, along with Christopher Hitchens and Daniel Dennett, who were writing these polemics against Christianity. But it turned out that Sam Harris wasn't actually an atheist in this sort of hardcore materialist sense, because he got really into meditation and spirituality and started writing books about this, where he was always really careful to say, but look, this is a scientific kind of spirituality. It's not like that crazy Western monotheism that thinks that God wants Abraham to kill Isaac and all these terrible Old Testament things. So that's an example of sort of where the spiritual center blurs into secularism because it wants to claim scientific authority. Or again, Robert Wright, who's a very smart writer on science and religion, has a book out this year called Why Buddhism is True. Why liberalism failed and why Buddhism is true. It's a great double feature. But his argument there too is he's saying, well, we're going to abstract away the theological ideas that are attached to Buddhism, and we're going to focus on the meditative practices that, have some sort of experimental data behind them and so on. So that's sort of, again, an example of how the spiritual center claims or wants to claim more scientific credibility the closer it gets to the salons of New York and Washington, D.C., and then it wants to claim more biblical authority the closer it gets to the Bible Belt, sort of areas that are religiously conservative. But either way, at the heart of it is a figure like the woman who probably won't be, but let's pretend will be a presidential candidate in 2020, Oprah Winfrey, right? Like, Oprah Winfrey is the heart of American spirituality. She brings in, she brings in sort of new thought, positive thinking gurus over here. She brings in lapsed megachurch pastors over there. She's got sort of scientific spirituality and New Age spirituality and semi-Christian spirituality. She goes around the country, did a couple years ago, doing what amounted to a kind of revival tour where Elizabeth Gilbert of Eat, Pray, Love and other sort of spiritual gurus, Deepak Chopra, of course, and so on, would speak. And I mean, this is the heart. This is the center of American religion right now, and it is what has sort of replaced mainline Protestantism. So if you go back 50, 75, 100 years, the American religious center are the mainline Protestant churches, and all the other religious groups, Mormon, Catholic, Jewish, plus the forebears of this spirituality, transcendentalists and so on, they're all sort of competing to sort of define themselves in relation to that mainline Protestant center. The mainline has declined, that their influence in elite life has disappeared, and you have this new center which is not that influential in elite life, but it's a sort of populist middle American center that has some influence at the elite level, but really sort of defines a more middle class, sort of normal American kind of approach to spirituality. And its essential quality is its individualism. It is the idea that there is a God within who is sort of identical to your authentic self, and that the key to spiritual development is to get in touch with your authentic self that is also identical somehow to a kind of possibly pantheistic view of God. I mean, the theology gets murky, but the essence is you are devising your own spiritual journey, and you are not ultimately submitting to an authority. This is, I like to talk about Eat, Pray, Love, which perhaps some of you have read, or you've seen the movie with Julia Roberts, or you've just heard of it. It's kind of an Augustine's Confessions for our age, except it's as if at the end, instead of becoming a Catholic Christian, Augustine had a series of incredibly mystical experiences and then went back and reconciled with his mistress and lived happily ever after without ever conforming himself to a particular religious tradition. And I don't mean this as a joke, I'm being perfectly sincere. This is the heart of Eat, Pray, Love. She goes to India and has religious experiences in an ashram. And they're complete, like it's a completely sincere religious text. This is the least secular book you will ever read. It's not a document of a sort of world that's lost religion or ceased to be interested in the supernatural or the metaphysical. It's a document of a world and a woman who's fascinated, who wants to connect with God, who wants to have spiritual experiences, who wants the universe to have meaning, but she doesn't want that meaning to be defined by anything larger than her own perspective, her own self. So she, has these experiences. She doesn't rejoin her childhood Christianity. She doesn't become a Hindu. She just remains herself in the church of herself. And that is where I think many, many Americans in our era have ended up. So I think thinking about American culture and bringing it back in a certain way to politics and culture wars and the kind of stuff that I write about a lot, this division helps make sense of a lot of conflicts, because basically one way to think about it is that in any culture war debate, in any sort of moral political conflict, the defining thing is what does the group in the middle decide? Where does the spiritual center move? And just to pick sort of two very pointed issues, right? We have a culture war, or we've had a culture war in this country over abortion and same-sex marriage. And on same-sex marriage, at a certain point, it became clear that there was no possibility that the spiritual center, this sort of very individualistic, sort of self-oriented form of faith, was going to be persuaded by arguments from the sort of biblical traditional perspective about the nature of marriage and so on, because those arguments rested on ideas about authority, natural law, sort of conformity to certain norms and so on, and they didn't fit at all with where the religious center was. The spiritual center. So the spiritual center ended up joining with sort of the secular part of America in being completely supportive of gay rights, same-sex marriage, and so on. And that was why that debate and battle ended the way it did. But on the other hand, a debate like abortion it puts individualism in tension with itself, because after all, the unborn child is itself an individual and has itself kind of individualistic claims and so on. And so the big spiritual center in America ends up permanently divided and uncertain about that question, simultaneously recoiling from abortion but wanting it to be available as a last-ditch thing, and seeing all the hard cases and so on. And that explains, I think, in part why the abortion debate remains this sort of perpetual point of tension, whereas the same-sex marriage debate did not. And then you can sort of proceed to some of the religious liberty debates that we've been having in our politics and culture lately, where, again, the huge political question is, what does this sort of spiritual center think? And they can be tugged this way or that depending on which side seems like the victim, which side seems like the victimizer, and so on. And so if sort of the secular world picture goes too far, if it seems to be sort of trampling on, Catholic hospitals or Catholic schools and so on, that spiritual center still, it's drifted from Catholicism if it was Catholic at some point, but it still likes Catholicism, it likes religion, it has favorable feelings towards people who believe in God because it believes in God somewhat itself. So it's going to recoil a little bit from a too aggressive, anti-clerical style of secularism. And swing back towards the kind of traditional biblical side of the argument. But then on the other hand, if the traditional biblical side is defined by, mistreating gay people or, being seen as sort of cruel and oppressive and so on, and all of these aspects of traditional religion that, again, the spiritual American sees as oppressive and authoritarian and something that it has escaped, then they're more likely to swing towards the secular side of the argument and embrace a certain amount of anti-clericalism and so on. So a lot depends in American politics and culture, not so much on where sort of the weekly mass-going Catholic or intense evangelical or devout Mormon ends up, and not so much also on where particularly the anti-religious, secular, skeptical, writing angry comments under my religious columns on the New York Times website person, not that I've read any of them, ends up. But the question is about the person in the middle, the person who has strong attachments to religion but weak sort of doctrinal commitments, is skeptical of religious authority in all its forms and so on. And a big story, the big trend of the last 10 or 15 years in sort of American religious identification is that the sort of traditional biblical core is sort of holding its own, but more and more people, the center is sort of moved. More spiritual people are identifying as secular, and certain people who would have at least partially affiliated with traditional religious institutions and denominations and churches have drifted more fully into the sort of this large spiritual middle. So you have this sort of resilience in traditional religious institutions, organizations, bodies, and so on, but it's a resilience of kind of 20% of the country. And then the question is, how post-Christian does the spiritual center get, and how secular does it sort of more secular fringe get? And that will determine, I think, what happens with a lot of debates about the place and role of religion in American life, the fate of conservative religious institutions, and all manner of other things. So that's sort of a sketch of sort of this picture and what it means for culture and politics. And then I just want to throw out a few speculative scenarios for possible ways that this could change, because it seems it's a fairly unstable dynamic in certain ways. And each world picture has specific and particular weaknesses, right? The weakness of the traditional biblical perspective is just this, there's this deep tension between the nature of modern life and the demands of New Testament, Old Testament, Quranic religion. And that tension has been here for a long time. It's sharpened since the sexual revolution around all issues related to sex. It's sharp around issues related to money and wealth and prosperity, I think, as well. It's sharp around a lot of issues. And there isn't some sort of magical solution that any particular church or community has come up with, I think, to sort of become an incredibly successful evangelizing force. So that's the challenge for that world picture. But then the spiritual world picture, it's because it's so individualistic and anti-institutionalist, it doesn't build the kind of permanent, lasting institutions that religious traditions use to sustain itself, and it doesn't provide the kind of communal and familial support that American religion at its Tocquevillian best has often done. So it leaves people alone and isolated in certain ways. And if their marriages break up, or they don't have kids, as more and more Americans don't, or they lose their jobs and so on, it leads, it's an insufficient, it's so personalized as to be insufficiently communal. And you can imagine ways in which people in that spiritual center could therefore drift back to the communal solidarity that the more traditional forms of faith provide. And then finally, the weakness of the secular picture is that it just doesn't make any sense. It's an intellectual weakness it's hard to tell how sociologically important intellectual weaknesses are, but the secular picture is basically trying to squeeze the stone of materialism as hard as it can in order to get a single drop of liberalism and human rights out. To sort of take a world picture that says the universe is a meaningless collision of atoms and somehow use that to generate the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, and all of the sort of moralism, the intense moralism that secular liberalism has. And it sort of works, or at least it does at the moment sociologically, but intellectually it's a bit of a mess. And this is why you can see the pull of these forms of spirituality, especially that claim a kind of scientific authority. So you can imagine a world in which the secular group becomes less secular, effectively, and sort of latches on to some kind of pantheistic conception of the universe, for instance. There was a book by a philosopher named Thomas Nagel that came out a couple years ago that was called Mind and Cosmos, that was extremely controversial because it attacked sort of neo-Darwinian materialism, basically, just the view that evolution explains consciousness, morality is an illusion, the universe is an accident, and so on. It attacked it in stark, I think fairly convincing philosophical terms. And Nagel, like a lot of people making this attack from sort of inside the secular world, seemed to be going in a pantheistic direction. He wanted to say, look, consciousness is a property of the universe, and this is why morality is real, and it's not just sort of something we make up, and so on, that there's some sort of ground of being that isn't the creator God of Judaism and Christianity, but is a sort of thing that you can engage with spiritually and engage with morally and perhaps build a more compelling world picture around. And I think I see a lot, like I think there's certain ways in which, secular readers are constantly auditioning potential religious metaphysics. They'll read that book, they'll read about Buddhism, they'll read these different sort of pantheistic and spiritual tracks and so on. They'll be tempted towards sort of more speculative, New Age beliefs and sort of pseudoscience that blurs into spirituality and so on. So you could imagine a world where at a certain point that sort of secular world picture sort of gives way to some kind of new elite religious consensus that that where sort of it's hard to see exactly how it would happen, but where sort of the ferment of meditation over here and yoga over there and all of these practices that secular people use to sort of fill in the spiritual space, where that with the right sort of intellectual movement or something, you get something like the spiritualism craze of late Victorian Europe, where you have this, this period where Darwin comes in and seems to shatter traditional Christianity. And what happens? The elite of Europe get really interested in, Swedenborgian spirituality, these sort of things that now seem eccentric and crazy to a lot of people, with apologies to any Swedenborgians in the room, but which were for a while, this sort of elite fascination and craze. I don't think it's impossible to imagine something like that happening, and therefore, so I don't think it's therefore impossible to imagine this kind of partial merger of kind of the Oprah spiritual center and the secular elite, where the center gets a little more intellectually rigorous and the elite get a little more spiritual, and you have some real, somewhat post-Christian New American religion. And then, in that scenario, the sort of biblical traditional world picture becomes even more culturally isolated than it is today. But you can also imagine alternative scenarios. You can imagine a scenario, and I think a lot of debates within institutional Christianity over sort of how to evangelize and how to reach out to people and so on, take this scenario as their goal. They say, look, you have this center, you have all these people who are still interested in religion, who are still interested in Christianity and spirituality and all of these things. They're reading the Da Vinci Code not because they don't care about Jesus, but because they still, they want to know about Jesus, and they're really excited to learn that he had a wife and a house in the suburbs and so on, just like them. So you have that desire, and the question is, well, how does the church meet it, right? And maybe there's a way to reach out and evangelize these people. And many of the debates within our own Catholic Church, many of the debates that have roiled the church in the Francis era that I've occasionally participated in, are about that question. That you have these people who have this loose connection to your church and to Christianity. How do you bring them back? Is the way of mercy or the way of rigor the best way to do it? And either way, you can imagine at some point that working. Somebody finds an evangelization strategy that works. You have some equivalent of the past Great Awakenings that we've had in American life, and suddenly the spiritual center gets more Christian. If Catholicism finds that strategy, it becomes more Catholic. And then it's the secular world picture that becomes more isolated in a country that's suddenly more traditionally Christian once again. And then finally, you could imagine, and I guess this is sort of the theory behind, writing pro-religion columns in the pages of the New York Times. You could imagine a kind of leapfrog where the elite, which is in the market for a new religion, decides that actually the old religion wasn't so bad after all. And so the sort of traditional biblical world picture sort of doesn't immediately persuade the individualistic Joel Osteen and Oprah center, but it suddenly starts to persuade elites again for the first time in a long time. And you have sort of, instead of this sort of token religious presence in great universities and elite newspapers and so on, you have a vibrant and meaningful religious presence, and you have a kind of intellectual conversion and revolution at the elite level. That seems to me to be the most unlikely of the scenarios that I've sketched, but I don't think it's completely impossible, because I think that, for all the real weaknesses of the biblical traditional position, the intellectual weaknesses and the kind of moral and spiritual weaknesses of secularism are also stark. And I guess this is sort of where I would leave you in this conversation and try and sort of link the beginning to the end, my own weird family experiences to the state of America. The truth is that, secularism can look very, very strong. It can look strong when you're sort of outside secular institutions, and it could look strong, I can promise you, when you're deep, deep inside them. But I came from a background that was, my parents were religious when I was a kid, before all this weird stuff started happening, but there was a very natural trajectory where we would have secularized along with most other sort of lukewarm Protestant baby boomers and their kids, and where I would be a sort of one of these religious nuns who have no religious affiliation and so on. And instead, the inevitable realities of human life intervened. Illness intervened, suffering intervened, the search for meaning intervened, and finally, perhaps, God intervened in the way that in people's lives he still seems to do. Even in our disenchanted age, religious experience and spiritual experience is a defining feature of human existence from which there is clearly no permanent escape. And as long as that's the case, secularism is weaker than it looks. So I'll end there. Thank you all so very much for listening. Yeah, it's complicated. The problem with all of these divisions and distinctions is they're a little artificial, and they break down the more you try and apply them to particular churches and particular situations. But my view basically is, so in part you have a sincere argument within the Catholic Church between people who share a sort of basic, what I would call the Catholic version of the traditional biblical world picture, and that argument is about how does the church adapt to this situation, and how do you evangelize? And that argument gets sort of broken down into conservatives and liberals, or traditionalists and liberals, and so on. But I would say a large segment of the liberals, who are people who I often find myself in arguments with, are fully sort of within the larger biblical traditional world picture. But then there's also a kind of sort of division, I think, within liberal Catholicism itself, where part of liberal Catholicism drifts towards the spiritual center. And the challenge for liberal Catholicism has been sort of, you're sort of defining yourself in adaptationist terms. How do you define yourself in adaptationist terms without losing your connection to authority, orthodoxy, and tradition, and so on? And I'm editorializing here, and lots of people have different takes, but one of the things that has been sort of striking and upsetting to me in some of these Pope Francis era debates is that I felt like 5 or 10 years ago there were people, friends, sparring partners, and so on within inter-Catholic debates where I thought of myself, I'm here, I'm center right, and he or she is there, and she's center left, and we have these sort of modest disagreements, and but there is a center there. And if we could, with the theory being then that if we could find that center between us, then that would enable us to more effectively evangelize the American center by saying, look, we've sort of recovered from our post-Vatican II civil war. We have this center that is sort of traditionalist in certain ways, adaptationist in others, and this could work as a potential new center for America. And to me, this is probably, the revelation of the Francis era has been that the sides in Catholic disputes are further apart than I thought. And that may reflect my own ignorance or naivete, it may reflect my own weirdnesses and drift and so on, but a lot of the people that I have ended up arguing with over Francis era changes and adaptations and so on have seemed to me further away from what I thought was my own not that traditionalist perspective than I thought. So that's sort of that's sort of my concern about Catholicism, is that, on the one hand, the liberal wing seems to, once the Pope sort of gives permission to have a debate, the liberal wing sort of drifts and drifts and drifts, and then meanwhile the conservative wing gets freaked out and goes that way hard. And my sense of things is that many younger Catholics I know who would have been sort of John Paul II conservatives 20 years ago now identify as traditionalists, in part because they think the John Paul II center wasn't a real center, it's not holding, it's a war of all against all, and we need to sort of hunker down. So that's sort of my really short analysis of how these debates are working. But I do think, the goal of Catholicism as a sort of cultural actor in the West should be to supply itself as an alternative center, basically, and say, we're here, we are not, Republicans, we are not Democrats, we have a mix of, social teachings that seem to lean more left and moral teaching that seem to lean more right, but that add up to a more solidaristic and communitarian vision of life than the West is offering, than anything else in the West is offering right now. And I think that vision has the potential to be, to make Catholicism more compelling in this, while contending for cultural influence writ large. And the problem of our own Catholic civil wars, as necessary as they may be, is that they make that center that much harder to offer to the world. So. Yeah, so I guess 5 years ago, when I wrote my last book, it always sounds pompous when you say that, but my last book was called Bad Religion, and it was sort of it came out 5 or 6 years ago, and it basically argued against a strong secularization thesis. It said the story of American religion is a story of institutional decline coexisting with continued belief and spiritual interest and so on. So I did a version of that in my talk, basically saying that what's happened is, evangelical churches are weaker than they were, the Catholic Church is weaker than it was, the main line is much weaker than it was, but all of the people drifting away aren't reading Richard Dawkins and slamming it down and saying, that's it, no more religion. They're, into New Age spirituality. They still pray or believe in God or believe in an afterlife and so on. And secularism is still a kind of very minority phenomenon concentrated among the elite. It's important to revise your conclusions as times change. And I would say that the last 6 years, sort of watching the trends, have made me more inclined to think that there's more drift towards pure secularism, just as you were saying, that this sort of, that there is, people are drifting out of institutional religion into sort of, Oprahism, and then they're also drifting right, or either going right through, not even stopping in Oprahism and just being secular, or they're drifting through and ending up secular in greater numbers than they were 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. But it's tricky because you want, there's a fairly strong amount of data that suggests that there's resilience in this kind of biblical, traditional, orthodox, whatever you want to call it, core. That sort of secularization isn't, if you look at the number of people who are, identify as strongly religious and go to church every Sunday or just about every Sunday, those numbers are not in free fall. What's happening is much more that the people who were going once a month or Christmas and Easter or something are just completely falling away now. So it's not necessarily the case that we should expect mass attendance to suddenly plummet or something in the next 20 years. It's more that you should expect Christmas and Easter attendance to plummet or something like that. Or it's more the case that, again, in Catholic terms, if you're thinking about the Catholic school system, right, that, there are a lot of parents who were invested in Catholic education for reasons of sort of ethnic identity and lukewarm Catholicism. And those parents in the next generation are not going to have that kind of investment. You're going to be dealing with people who are just there for the education and are secular, or people who are more intensely Catholic without that cohort in between. But with evangelicalism, my sense is that evangelicalism rose basically as the main line declined from sort of the 70s through the late 90s, and then it hit a ceiling and plateaued. And those are really interesting data points because I go back and forth reading the data on whether that plateau has turned into a real decline yet or not. And I've read basically data on both sides, things saying, look, the number of Southern Baptists has started to go down, things like seminary enrollment and so on have gone down, but other data points, again, suggesting that indicators like weekly church attendance and so on are holding steady. So I think there the data is a little unclear, and in 5 or 10 years we'll have more of a sense. I mean, one of my, we have all these debates, of course, about the Trump era and Donald Trump's effect on religion and so on. And one of the concerns that I hear, especially in the evangelical world, is that you have this generational divide where older evangelicals are for Trump and younger evangelicals are more skeptical, and that the sort of fervency of pro-Trump sentiment among older evangelicals, some people worry, is going to contribute to the phenomenon you're describing, that more younger evangelicals are going to say, well, you say we're for biblical morality and you're supporting a guy who sleeps with porn stars in the White House, not in the White House, the grammar of that sentence was not quite right, but you know what I mean. And that is going to contribute to a falling away. So that, that's sort of a place where it enters into political debates, like what effect do these sort of political things have on religious attachment and affiliation. But anyway, the short answer is yes, I think you're right. Real secularization is happening a little more than I thought. And the unanswered question is how much? So that's a good question. I don't have a perfect answer. I certainly think you're right. I think that sometimes in these talks, it's useful to think about like Billy Graham and Joel Osteen as interesting contrasts, right? Where, if you listen to a Billy Graham sermon from the 50s, you hear some of the stuff that you hear from a Joel Osteen sermon today. Billy, he talks about God's universal love. He talks about God has a plan for you. God loves you. God is here for you, and so on. That message is there, but half of the message is the cross. So it's God's love plus suffering, plus denial. And Osteen and many other successful preachers in our culture, and of course such preachers existed in the 50s too, I think they just have more influence now, say, we don't need the cross stuff, we'll just tell you God wants you to be happy. And to the extent that there's a practically minded answer to it, I think the best answer is that, those over the life cycle, that promise is a lie. There's no evidence that God wants you to be happy all the time. None whatsoever. And you might delude yourself at various points. And look, America is a very rich country, and so it's easier to delude yourself on that front. It's easier not to think about death and illness and the last things and so on. And when you're young now, it's easy to have sort of perpetual stimulation, video games, pornography, and so on that can play a similar role. But human beings don't live perpetually as healthy video game playing 25-year-olds, or even as sort of successful 45-year-olds at the peak of their professional earnings and so on. They get old and bad things happen and they get sick and they die. And that hasn't changed as far as I've noticed. And as long as that's the case, a purely individualistic religion is going to let people down. And the question is, it's in sociological terms, to what extent can the churches be the churches that have a more realistic perspective on human life, be there communally for people who are let down by individualism? And this might mean young men who are adrift and unmarried and barely employed at 33 and are looking for direction. There's this guy, some of you may have heard of him, named Jordan Peterson, who's a professor at the University of Toronto, who has built this huge online cult following basically by just, doing YouTube videos where he tells young men to shape up. There are other figures like that in our culture who are not, he has strong religious interest, I think, without strong religious commitments, but he's sort of, you're going to get more sort of entrepreneurs like that who are sort of saying to people, look, individualism is letting you down. Here's the way to become a man, to really be happy. And that's sort of the challenge for the churches, is to fold that together with the gospel, the gospel message. But similarly, it's not just the young, it's, we're going to be a society of older people with fewer siblings, fewer children, and fewer social connections than any society in human history. And those are people that the churches today are not that well equipped to reach, in the sense that our churches are sort of organized like you got your young adults group, and then you get married and you put your kids in Sunday school or religious education and so on, and then you get old and become a pillar of the community in your church with your large Catholic family or large Mormon family around you. And lots of people aren't living that life cycle, and they're going to be coming in contact with the church at various points where they don't fit that narrative. They're a divorced, they're a divorcee who's 55 with one kid somewhere who's moved away, that kind of thing. And so I think the sort of structural challenge for churches is to figure out, what are you offering to people who are deep into the life cycle and have been let down by individualism and are alone and need help. And that's more a challenge for pastors than for journalists, probably. Journalists are always sort of pushing the actual challenges off onto other people. But it's certainly a challenge that, thinking about, if you look at the Middle Ages and you look at sort of the communities of, not nuns and priests per se, but sort of like, older women who got together and, took some mild religious vow and lived together in communal spaces and so on. Like, in that past, there might be some future for churches sort of reaching out to people sort of aging into solitude in our hyper-individualistic society. So that's at least one way that I've thought about the challenge. So, yes. Well, it's an American phenomenon. And I think it reflects in part sort of the nature of our Protestant heritage in certain ways, that the Protestant tradition is not in every church and denomination, but historically individualistic and more skeptical of state power and state authority than Catholicism. And therefore the most sort of religiously intense and morally conservative parts of American life have had these sort of anti-state, not sort of libertarian in an Ayn Rand sense, but libertarian in a kind of, we're Baptists, you're going to persecute us, so leave us alone kind of way. And Catholicism has sort of entered into that world without necessarily, it sort of had to find its way in a world that's defined by sort of Protestant norms and tensions. And I think there was a brief period where, the Democratic Party, under heavy Catholic influence in the New Deal, from the New Deal era to the sexual revolution, basically had some of that aspect. It was a somewhat morally conservative, pro-family party that was also more economically liberal. But the sexual revolution basically smashed that apart. And since then, each party will sort of reach for it, like, compassionate conservatism was basically at least a sort of rhetorical attempt to reach out to Catholics, in effect, to say, look, we're conservative, but we're not, heartless industrialists. We are interested in the common good and so on. And similarly, the Democrats will sort of, occasionally, less so now, but when they're doing particularly badly at the ballot box, they'll say, well, we could be we could have some pro-life candidates again, right? We could try that again here and there. So there'll be this sort of reach for that center, but as Catholicism has gotten weaker, politicians have fewer incentives to reach for that kind of center, and they imagine a different center. And then also that center is less appealing to elites, right? That center asks elites to give up more of their money and have less sexual freedom. And if you're, a successful, especially a successful young person in America, that's not a message that goes over well in Silicon Valley. Have less money and less sex. Not a big Northern Californian message, and it's not a message that goes over well on Wall Street and so on. It's a message that it's hard to find donors for that kind of message. So it's a challenge, and the reason you have more political parties historically like that in Europe is that the church was stronger in Europe and essentially provided the political backbone, for the Catholic Center Party in Germany, or for Christian democracy in post-World War II Europe was in effect partially a project of the institutional church. And the church in the US doesn't have that kind of influence and has less so. I mean, one of the interesting things about Trump is that on the campaign trail, in his, vulgar and bigoted way, he sometimes seemed to be reaching for a version of that synthesis, where, I mean, clearly he was no personal moral conservative, but he was paying lip service at least to social conservatives, and then he was trying to be more populist than the normal Republican candidate. He was talking about bringing jobs back to the Midwest. He was promising, health care for all and all these kinds of things. And as someone, in my life as a policy writer, I've spent a lot of time trying to prod the Republican Party in that kind of direction. So it was a little strange to suddenly see Donald Trump doing a version of that prodding. And it was the reason Trump won in the Midwest was that he had this weirdo version of a kind of Catholic politics, and he was winning sort of, laid off lapsed Catholics, basically, who had this sort of in the back of their heads. But then as president, the structure of American politics has just reasserted itself. Trump doesn't have any interest in policy. He's not capable of running his own administration, let alone guiding the Congress. And so you have a reversion to, whatever ideas Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell had on the shelf. And so Trump will say, well, why don't we just put everybody in Medicare? And Ryan will be like, let's not talk about that. Let me explain to you why, these ideas from the Heritage Foundation are actually the way to go. And sometimes Ryan is right. I mean, I agree with some libertarian ideas on some issues, but I'm also skeptical of them on others. But regardless, I think Trump had an opportunity to, in this very Trumpian way, push politics, sort of shake up our politics, basically, and sort of grasp for a center on policy that was a little different from this sort of, libertarians of the bedroom versus libertarians of the boardroom kind of clash that we have. And because he's Trump, that opportunity has... So it's time, but why don't I take one more? Can I take a last one? The question is, how can we understand George W. Bush and Barack Obama as evangelical Christians? And there are, as both being evangelical Christians, and there are, let's say, three answers. The first two answers, I'm not sure which. I don't think it's quite correct to think of Obama as an evangelical in the way that people usually use the term, because Jeremiah Wright's church, that was sort of his entree into Christianity, was more heavily informed by Black liberation theology than, I would say, the sort of, if you look at like the African Methodist Church as the kind of norm of Black evangelicalism, Wright was more to the theological left and had a more sort of political gospel in certain ways. I don't want to claim expertise on his church and vision, but he drew on James Cone and these other late 60s liberation theologians, and I think that's if you use the term evangelical to cover them both, you're still talking about a lot of theological distance between them. That said, the other issue is just that the framework, including almost every framework that analyzes these things, including the framework that I just described, tends to not do justice to the complexities of race and how it intersects with religion and sort of the particular position of the Black church and also increasingly Latino churches in the U.S. Because if you said, well, where does the Black church fit in your description? Well, it is often the most biblical of churches, but on every political issue, it ends up allied with, with sort of a left-wing coalition consisting of the spiritual center and the secular elite, and it does so for, I think, generally understandable reasons having to do with racial politics. And it also does so in part because of the sort of historical institutional weakness of those churches. I think that, the fact that African American religion has been marginalized in American life means that the African American church doesn't run the universities and hospitals and so on that the Catholic Church tends to run. And so it doesn't feel as threatened by liberalism, by sort of secularism in power. Like a lot of these religious liberty debates are sort of, it's black clergy will say, well, I agree with you on the principle, but I don't see my own sort of denomination as threatened in the way that your hospital network is, because we don't have that hospital network, so that's more your problem and not ours. So there are ways in which some of these tensions are not felt as strongly between the black church and secular liberalism just for those institutional reasons. But one of the really interesting things, and this is, I'll stop talking here, but is in that spiritual center that I'm talking about, the part of it that's sort of Pentecostalist, right? So if you think Pentecostalism sort of, I'm drawing too many circles here, but it sort of overlaps biblical and spiritual, right? Pentecostalism is the most pan-racial religious tradition in America. It is, there is sort of, and the prosperity theology part of it in particular. Prosperity theology is incredibly popular with a certain segment of white America that always votes Republican, and it's very popular with a segment of black and Hispanic America that's more likely to vote Democratic, but it is really the same theology and the same theological tradition. Now, I didn't even think about this as a kid, but when we were briefly in this sort of Pentecostalist world and we would get Kenneth Copeland's Believer's Voice of Victory, these sort of mailings from this famous Pentecostalist prosperity theologian. I didn't even realize he was a prosperity theologian because my parents weren't interested in that part, but you would see these genuinely pan-racial revival meetings with a black minister over here and a white guy from Oklahoma over there and so on. And that's it's an example, again, of sort of where I started out, that sort of religion in America is just we're a nation of 300 million people, and it's just more complex than the inevitable binaries that partisan politics creates, especially these days. So, thank you. Thank you, guys. It was a lot of fun. Thanks for coming.